Hello and a warm welcome to all of you joining us remotely for today's GSF webinar, which is called Assessing the 2021 Integrated Review, the Right Choices for Global Britain ? And a very warm welcome too to our panel here with me today, whom I shall introduce to you in a moment. More than a year in the making and delayed by lockdown, the long-awaited Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, which calls itself Global Britain in a Competitive Age, and the accompanying Defence Command paper, Defence in a Competitive Age, were of course finally published last month. When the Integrated Review was announced back in February 2020, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, described it as the most far-reaching since the Cold War, and there was certainly widespread agreement that it was time to reassess our foreign defence and security strategy and the approach that we've taken since the last such review in 2015. The past 6 years have seen dramatic changes, both at home and abroad, even before the extraordinary global crisis triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. With the review's publication, the government has now taken the opportunity to present its long-term strategic aims for national security and foreign policy, and articulated, it hopes, an overarching vision for Britain's global role over the next 10 years. As we will go on to discuss today, the accompanying Defence Command paper also sets out a major overhaul of the armed forces to meet what's been described as an action-orientated agenda. I thought that now we've had a few weeks to digest the review's contents, it would be a good idea to convene this expert panel today to critique its conclusions and to discuss whether it meets the goals and ambitions set for it. Today's event is a view-only one, but I hope to be able to take some live questions today. Please do still submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function as usual. But if all works smoothly and I am able to call you, do watch closely for an invitation to unmute yourselves, and I will then invite you to ask your question. If you would prefer me to read it instead, just indicate that by typing "read" before your question. But I hope very much we'll be able to hear directly from some of you today. We will be recording the event, and we'll make that recording available online for you as soon as possible. Details of how to access it via your YouTube channel will be posted on our website, which is, as you probably know, www.globalstrategyforum.org. For those on Twitter, we will be tweeting the event on GSF's account using the hashtag GSF Events Day. So you ought to be able to catch up with it even if you aren't able to follow it all at this precise moment. But now, turning to our panel, I'm delighted to have with me this morning, on my left, General Sir Richard Barrons, KCB, CBE. Richard's had a long and distinguished military career, which included the last decade of the Cold War and leadership from captain to general on military operations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He served as Commander Joint Forces Command from 2013 to 2016, where he was responsible for 23,000 people worldwide and a budget of £4.3 billion. He is now co-chairman of Universal Defence and Security Solutions, and he advises and comments widely on senior leadership, defence and security. He is also, I'm very glad to say, a member of the advisory board of GSF. Next to him is Professor Michael Clarke, who was Director General of RUSI from 2007 to 2015, where he remains a distinguished fellow. He is an advisor to 2 parliamentary committees and Associate Director of the Strategic Studies Institute at the University of Exeter. He's known to many of you as one of the most authoritative voices on defence and security policy strategy in the country, and he is co-author of Tipping Point, Britain, Brexit and Security in the 2020s, which was published in November 2019. And Mike, we're delighted to have you speak on it as at GSF when it came out. I'm delighted that he's also a member of the advisory board of GSF. And to his left, I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome to GSF Oliver Lewis, who is one of the 3 co-founders of Rebellion Defence. Rebellion is at the cutting edge of technology. It builds products using artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to serve the mission of national security and defence for the United States, the United Kingdom and allies. Previously, he was Deputy Director of the United Kingdom Government Digital Service, and he built the public sector business at Improbable, which was a £1 billion startup that applies groundbreaking cloud computing simulation to government. Early in his career, he was a United Kingdom Ministry of Defence Intelligence Officer, Policy Advisor and Strategy Advisor, with 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and Oliver is a research fellow at the University of Oxford's Changing Character of War Centre, and we're very pleased to have him with us here today. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, and I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Michael. You perhaps will give us a general overview, and we'll proceed then with Richard and then Oliver.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. Yes, just in a couple of minutes, I thought I'd say something about the geopolitical impact of the review process, so as not to tread on the toes of my co-panelists. And I begin with the idea that the conception of this was absolutely right. This was what academics and analysts have been calling for years, a complete overview, not just of defence, but of all of the other elements that create Britain's outward-facing suite of policy levers in a way that we can grasp for the 2020s. And the 2 documents that Michael mentioned were accompanied, of course, by a new strategy on defence industries, a strategy on cyber, on AI, on science and technology. So there's a slew of documents which comprise this whole review. So full marks for the ambition behind it, which was very important. And the main geopolitical headlines I take from these documents are, one is that global Britain intends to have a more obvious global footprint, whatever that might mean in practice. We intend to be out and about more than we were before, and to get through this rather introspective decade that we've had since the financial crisis of 2008. Secondly, that we intend to compete in the grey area between normal diplomacy and conflict, that below the threshold grey area that so worries defence and security planners. I often think it's a bit like a football manager saying to the team, don't give them the midfield. Compete in the midfield. Don't just attack or defend. Compete in the middle field, in the middle of the pitch. And in a way, that's what we intend to do, to compete in the grey area. This issue of a shift to the Indo-Pacific, I think, has been overwrought somewhat. There's a lot more about it in the first document, the overview, than there is in the defence document. And I think what we're really talking about is more presence in the Indo-Pacific, but not necessarily a big reorientation of our defence towards that. The Atlantic area still remains the most important part of our defence concentration, even though the Navy will have a better ability to go wider. A lot of this reorientation is based on the ambitions in it are based on science and technology, on the idea that we will try to leap into the 2030s by the mid-2020s. We'll try to, as it were, get half a generation ahead by the judicious use of science and technology. It's very ambitious. There's a couple of things in it that we haven't seen before. One is, given that we're in Brexit, there's a Brexit-sized hole in all of these documents. The EU is mentioned hardly at all, and the way in which we will relate to our EU partners on defence and foreign policy is very, very vague, and that's rather disappointing. The other thing, I think, which is interesting, I've never seen this in a defence review or any other review before, either during the Cold War or since, is a concern with the Union of the United Kingdom. It comes up again and again and again, and there's a whole essay on it in the defence paper, how important defence is and our foreign policy is to the Union. And so there's a degree of fear, I think, about that runs through the document. What do I think are the problems with the whole approach? It's the right approach, but the documents have been somewhat disappointing because they lack some strategic coherence in lots of ways. The decisions on foreign aid, you can argue about whether it's a good or a bad idea to reduce foreign aid in the way it's now being reduced, but it is strategically incoherent in terms of the global Britain that we intended to be. We cast ourselves as a reliable partner, as a burden sharer, as a problem solver, as at the very time when we're taking aid away from some of the territories that matter most to us because of the way in which these cuts particularly work. There's an incoherence in that. There's an incoherence in the nuclear announcements that were made, increasing warhead numbers from 180 up to 260, for a rationale that doesn't I think, convince anybody who knows anything about our nuclear strategy. There may be some good thinking behind this, but it's certainly not in the documents. And it puts us on the wrong side of the Non-Proliferation Review Conference later this year. It undermines some of the support we've had from many other states in the view we've taken on disarmament and on arms control. It's going to take some sorting out, some explanation from the government, which I think they'll have to come back to. It's not clear what the Foreign Office and the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, what its role really will be in the future of the way Whitehall relates to the outside world. Science and technology funding is still very much up in the air. And not least, the three services are moving in at different paces through all of this. The Navy, which is the least transformational on its planned future, the Navy knows what it's going to look like by 2030. The Air Force can see what it needs to look like by 2030, but it's got quite a long way to go. The Army has been left with the biggest job and the least resource to do it, and is, as it were, has got the biggest conceptual problem in trying to transform itself on the basis of lower numbers. So there's a lot of incoherence there. My overall conclusion with this is that the fact that the documents have been a little bit disappointing doesn't mean to say that the process will fail. The process could be good. The urge to conduct this review is exactly right. But the documents look rushed. They don't look as if they've been really well thought through. There are lots of mistakes in them, including typos, including mistakes. We have overseas territories, I notice, in one part of them. There's lots wrong with these documents, but the process may be right. It will depend on the follow-up and the consistency. The danger is that the government will say, oh, we've done that now, tick that box, move on. Move on to worrying about the union, whatever it might be. They've got to stick with it, and it's got to be more vigorously pursued. The disappointment with these documents is, in a way, they're too much of a conceptual essay and not enough of a real discussion of the ends, ways and means with some specifics. After all this time, we're still at the beginning of the process, not the end of the process.
Thank you very much, Michael. Perhaps we can get down to some of the specifics today in our answer.
Indeed.
Richard, can I ask you to?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So we had really high hopes of this review, and it was a long time coming. It was postponed by the pandemic. And I think it's worth just reflecting for a moment on some of the big expectations that we had of it, and then we might score them. The first thing is, as Michael has described, we expected this review to get a grip of the changing strategic environment. We all sense that comfortable US-led post-Cold War, post-Second World War era had finished, and what appears to be replacing it, ill-defined I think, feels more threatening and challenging and uncertain. So there's a new strategic context to consider. We also recognise that every single day the UK is being harmed in what Michael described as the midfield, this combination of the levers of power short of the use of military force. So it's things like cyber and social media tinkering and proxies and things like even the Skripal nerve agent attack. So we knew we were being harmed, and we were hoping the review would chart a way of being harmed less, deterring more, and if necessary, playing it back. We knew the UK was fragile, and the pandemic has definitely illustrated that, whether that's from natural or man-made disaster or this sort of midfield confrontation, or indeed at risk from burgeoning military power elsewhere in the world. So the question of resilience was firmly on the agenda, and that extends to things like our supply chains, and just one big super ship jamming up the Suez Canal has illustrated that point recently. The fourth thing is, we absolutely knew then, and we know now, that the digital age will change how we do defence and security in terms of capability and method. And no doubt, Ollie will talk a lot more about this. So we wanted to know, well, what is this path through modernisation to transformation? What's it actually going to consist of? We knew that the defence budget was broken. We saw and were delighted by £16.4 billion being given to defence and held to be extra? And do we know that 16 billion of those pounds simply filled in some of the holes in the defence programme, but not all of them? So were we really going to have a review that balanced the books in the end? And the sixth one I want to highlight is, we know that every defence review since 1997 is something we might want to talk about on another time. Every single defence review has failed. They have plenty of lofty ambition, that's easy and cheap, but there's always been a gap between the ambition and the resources, and that gap filled by hope, largely hope that our allies and our enemies would cooperate, and that the services would find Herculean efficiencies to save money that would close the gap. And as we rolled into this integrated review, we knew we were billions out in the programme. Well articulated, I think. So what about the scores? Well, first of all, I think it does acknowledge there is this different world. So that's good. That charts that we're in new waters. And then I think it fails to say, yes, but we're at risk now, and we have to move faster and harder to do something about it in our own hard-headed national interest. The second thing I think it does, particularly in the Defence Command paper, it begins to chart this path to modernisation of our defence and security, and the Integrated Operating Concept 2025 and related documents are saying, I think, very encouraging things. But this review charts a path to that transformation, which is long, slow, as yet ill-defined, and I accept that, but under-resourced. And whilst we take our time to do this in a rather anemic way, we're going to run considerable risk. Related to that, and I think it's regrettable, is that the review makes cuts now in mass and resilience and takes some older kit out of service sooner. So despite the fact we don't know what transformation really looks like, and we do know we're going to take a long time to get there, in this middle period, we're going to get smaller and we're going to hollow ourselves out some more. Is that okay? I think that is at odds with the sort of world we're beginning to describe. And then related to that, there's a huge list in the papers of the good things we're going to do. Lots of we're going to intend or encourage or support, sometimes attached to naming organisations and small packets of money. This is good. There's plenty of good thinking in there, but absolutely no sense that these packets of people and money are going to make a difference. And I think we are still guilty of tokenism, of describing to ourselves really significant problems that touch on our vital interests, and then saying we're going to fix them with a ministerial phone call, a couple of £1 million over 10 years, and some small number of clever people in the Foreign Office and elsewhere in government. That world, I think, has passed, and we've not yet broken out of tokenism, for all that the quality of the direction, I think, is encouraging. Next, I think it absolutely underplays resilience. Resilience is on the agenda. Absolutely terrific that number 10 is going to have a sit-sen that would give the heart of government a clearer view of the resilience of the country. But I think we haven't unpacked this into its full physical, human, digital and cognitive dimensions, and we've not made this a whole of society effort. And yet the world which we are describing to ourselves needs that sort of resilience. So this is a major programme, and we're really only in the foothills of it. And then I don't think, although it refreshes the fusion doctrine, this harnessing of all the levers of power, which is a very good and important thing, I don't think we've gone far enough in recognising that the way the UK will make its world, this global Britain, is by harnessing the power of the private sector. Many people around the world are much more interested in the Premier League, in our film, entertainment, banking, law, insurance, technology, than they are in anything the government or the armed forces do right now. And it's only by harnessing the power of our private sector to our vital interests, our prosperity and our security, that I think we'll make our way. And we have to recognise that our opponents in the world make no division between their private and their public sector. So we maybe need to catch up. And if I could wrap all of that up in one sense, which is we've described a world which is no longer post-war. That era has finished. We've started to describe a world which is so very challenging, it feels pre-war. And that would take a very different conceptual and physical and resourced approach to deal with it. So maybe we should change the lexicon. If we think of ourselves now as pre-war, then we're going to think differently, we're going to act sooner, we will find more resources. And by thinking pre-war, we'll see off the war that otherwise we may just bumble into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Some very interesting thoughts there. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you. I think, so the integrated review from the perspective of a technologist, I think was finally quite outstanding, because we had a pragmatic understanding of China as a strategic rival that's looking to monopolize, or where it can't, to reinvent our global digital infrastructure, to protect its networks and create sovereign dependencies across every part of the technology stack. So liberal democracies, we no longer have that advantage of having invented the internet. That moment has passed. And in the review, there's science and technology as a golden thread that unites economic power, military power, and political power for a national security advantage. That was another good score, to use Richard's language. And then it outlines how we will use science and technology to our advantage in a way that will pragmatically recognize we need investment, we need to develop and attract new, diverse and eccentric talent, particularly technical talent, into the national security sector. So it recognizes the skills and the recruitment. And then finally, particularly then in the command paper, it recognizes that a modern digital backbone is the critical missing dimension of British military power. And the review outlines the characteristics of a competitive technological arms race, where you have Britain, the US, and groups like NATO, where we've had a narrow advantage that is being eaten away by our competitors because of their aggressive investment, because of their whole of economy approach that Richard mentioned, because of a lack of legal constraint, and because of a much lower overall barrier of entry to developing technologies that could alter the course of war. But there's a tendency to see an arms race as something quite straightforward, as a Formula One race or as an Olympic race, where every competitor broadly has the same characteristics and operates within similar conditions and constraints. And if you qualified for the race, any competitor could in theory win. I think we should see this tech arms race as much closer to the 1960s cartoon Wacky Races. And you've got a race where every competitor is unique, with different advantages and disadvantages, and where the only commonality is in the race environment itself. And I think Britain and the US are starting this race closer to the character of Peter Perfect. So it's this very gentlemanly racer in the car, the turbo terrific. And Peter, he's extremely strong, but also incredibly vain. And he often boasts of the virtues of his very high-tech car moments before it falls to pieces. And to extend this, I think you could probably say that Russia is Dick Dastardly. So a car with lots of hidden weaponry, and it races to the front very quickly. It tries to set traps for the racers that follow, but it ultimately loses because it typically gets in its own way. And why then do I think it's wacky races? So I think our military capabilities are extremely high-tech, but we're built to win another race in another age, and we're rightly proud of them. But I don't think we've evolved our manufacturing processes nor our race strategy for this new environment. And nor do most of our drivers, our commanders and politicians recognize or even admit that this is a new race that will necessitate radically new strategies and tactics. And the other critical thing why it's wacky races is not every competitor can win the race. But every competitor, even the weakest, has a chance of undermining any other competitor's chance of victory. And these traditional inputs that could guarantee success, so more money over a longer period of time, become increasingly less relevant. And that's especially where software and cyber are concerned. And there's been this assumption that a mature defense industry is to our advantage. That's also less relevant now, and one could say particularly where software and cyber come into play, a mature defence industry becomes a national security threat rather than a virtue. And then we have our gentlemanliness, and our gentlemanliness could also be to our disadvantage. So as this liberal democracy, our legislation, our doctrine, our concepts, and our political morality, they shape how we can apply these new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence. And many of our authoritarian adversaries simply field the tech and see what happens. And we should be proud of that advantage we have. But in order to offset the disadvantages of that liberal democracy, we need rapid reform of procurement and our commercial processes. We need radical change in the culture and structure of the armed forces. And I think the army is facing one of the largest difficulties here. And we need a much less market palatable approach to investment and economic risk in research and development. And so the car we should be aiming for, I think, is Professor Pat Pending's car. And this is the car that can quickly transform into pretty much anything that moves. And China's approach is already that of the professor. So unencumbered by liberal economic rules of fair competition or an old-fashioned military and political bureaucracy, China's choosing to research and develop scientific and particularly consumer technology with national security interests front and center. And so to develop an approach like that, we need to push out our ministerial bureaucracies. We need to hold the existing defense industry much more accountable to what they produce. We need to ensure that military commanders have a deep understanding not only of hardware but also of software. And we need to get our house in order when it comes to data. I mean, to knowing what the data is, where it is, and making it accessible and interoperable with our own systems, our own institutions, and our allies. And we need to make these changes extremely quickly, and not at the pace of the Ministry of Defence typical staffing and review process. And one way I think about grappling with that bureaucracy and the usability of data is to reframe the speed with which we develop and deploy military capability as the single most critical factor in designing, building, and fielding military tech. And if we go back to that notion of a race, most races are ultimately about speed, and military tech is in that very unenviable position of having to accommodate multiple different speeds of the development of hardware and software. So if you think traditional military hardware is constrained by the speed in which you can manipulate and harden physical materials, so even electrical systems are subject to some of those constraints. And that constraint of physical manipulation provides the human mind with more than enough time to plan and fund and field. But software, which operates and directs and determines the action of most of that military hardware, it has a wildly different framework of speed and time associated with it. And good software can be written with incredibly small teams at incredibly quick period of time. And more than that, software is typically built to be minimally viable. So it can deliver value at a very early stage of programming, well before it is finished. And so what does that mean? Well, you've got two systems of development and manufacturing that are codependent. The hardware now only works with the software installed. And the software only has meaning in interacting and operating with that military hardware. And yet one is built in a time of months and years and is pretty useless until it's finished. And the other is built in days and weeks and is useful pretty quickly. And software's never finished. It undergoes, in the industry, what we call continuous integration and continuous development. So it's alive, it's a perpetual work in progress, and it's updated and improved at a regular cadence. So that can be a cadence of weeks for consumer software. So in planning military capability, the program leader has to be able to work at multiple speeds simultaneously. They need to understand enough about how hardware works and how software is deployed, how they interact together, with the overall objective, if we're to achieve pretty much anything in the integrated review, with being able to deliver incredibly quickly minimally viable military capability. It's no longer exquisite platforms that take a long period of time. But this is where I feel that Mike and Richard share my frustration, in that the integrated review and the command paper, it knows all of this. So the command paper quotes, "We will invest in agile, interconnected and data-driven capabilities of the future," and then recognizing that the pace of tech change will require us to constantly adapt, experiment and take risks to preserve that kind of strategic advantage. And now it's, well, how are you going to do that? Because we've heard the story before.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I'd like to start by asking a question of my own, which in a sense brings together a number of questions we've had over the past few days. As widely anticipated, the plan reduced the size of the army to 75,500 soldiers by 2025, with emphasis instead on drones and cyber warfare. And this was one of the most striking and controversial decisions of the review. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, justified it by saying that increased deployability and technological advantage means greater effect can be delivered by fewer people. But as I think we're all aware, some very senior soldiers around the country, retired and probably also still in post but silently, have raised some very serious criticisms of the move. Richard Dannett, Lord Dannett, a former head of the army, said that the UK would no longer be able to fight two major operations at the same time as a result. David Richards, Lord Richards, former chief of the Defence Staff, said the United Kingdom would no longer be able to retake the Falkland Islands. Sir James Bucknell, writing this week for GSF, called for the reversal of what he called disastrous cuts, which would fillet the army and which represented a severe loss of capability. Across the Atlantic, similar disquiet's been expressed by US Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, amongst others, that the British Army will henceforth be too small for purpose. So these are very serious criticisms. Are they right? Or is the Defence Secretary right? And what reshaping of the armed forces would each of you advocate to meet our future threats, challenges and needs? If you can answer briefly, I'd be very interested to get some reaction to that.
So perhaps I should start. So I think you can make a cogent argument that there is a way out of this, which is in the future, the Army, Navy and Air Force will no longer just be about people manning equipment. They will increasingly be a manned, unmanned, autonomous mix where you might need fewer people for a given mass. But we aren't anywhere near that right now. The second thing, and I regret this, is the conversation about the army has tended to be only about the number of people. It's not been about, well, have you got enough equipment for these people? And the answer to that is no. Have you got enough sustainability? You know, the army and defence talk about a fight-tonight capability, so ready to go, which they need to be. But the fact is that they're exhausted by the day after tomorrow because they'll have run out of stuff. So we need to reset, and I'm going to go back to my analogy, we need a pre-war mentality in the way we think about the army, which is it has to be something that is ready to go now in the way that we need it to be, that it is capable of mobilization, that it can get bigger when we need it to be, and it can be resilient, which is to say that it can prepare, deploy and operate with the homeland in some jeopardy, and when it does that, it can replace its casualties. And we just don't have that now, and that is amplified by the concern the army doesn't yet really know what it's going to look like in the future. And the answer to that problem cannot be to strip people out now and get rid of a lot of equipment earlier and fail to modernize some, just to increase the risk of the gap that we're now managing. And so I think we have successfully in the review charted a way forward, and now we need to recognize, having charted the way forward, we need to get on with it, and we need to adopt a fresh paradigm in the way we think about the Army, Navy and Air Force, which is to be fit for war, not for just turning up in small packets around the world briefly.
Thank you. Michael?
I would only add to that, in trying to introduce technological change to an organisation, in theory, you should introduce that change before you start reducing the size of that organisation, and then the change will give you a guidance as to where you might then be able to reduce. What the Army is suffering from is reduce now and then make up for it later with all these technological fixes, which, as Richard said, will take some time to come on. So in a way, the thing is back to front if you could do it on a blank piece of paper. And in terms of the structure of the forces, I've been worrying for years that the Army and the Navy in particular have structured themselves in the last 10 years for the wars they would prefer to fight. So the Navy has structured itself around the carrier battle group and the idea of a global role, and the Army has structured itself post-Afghanistan around the idea that it's a European directed force to the sort of conflict on the continent of Europe. And I don't see enough in the review to try to bring those visions together. And I'd like to say, I hope to see a lot more in the next 2 or 3 years. That's why I said I hope the government just doesn't tick the box and move on. It's got to really stay with this. It's got to make good on all of the things that are promised in the review, not least of which is to bring the 3 armed services together in a much better conception, the integrated operational concept, to make it mean something in the way in which they're going in the 2020s.
Oliver.
I think it's really quite straightforward in that if we assume the political constraint of strategy by financial accounting is just where we are, a large force with cutting-edge technology will win, a large force with no cutting-edge technology will lose, a small force with cutting-edge technology could win, and if you can invest in that cutting-edge technology, then you can scale the force after you've done that. But to assume that we can definitely win with a small force with cutting-edge technology is hubristic.
It's like boxing, isn't it? It's a good big one will always beat a good small one.
I've got a question coming in from Sir David Logan, which I hope he'll be able to get through to us to give it live. So, David?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, very good. It's about the Navy route, Alan Michael just touched upon. The Queen Elizabeth is just deploying at the moment to Far East. I recall that when she first deployed to the Mediterranean, the Russian embassy in London, who are always good for a laugh, treated a nice target. And the information was that without adequate support, she would be vulnerable. She's now deploying to Far East, where she will be operating with American forces, and at risk, I guess, is ruled out as partly. But she won't always be deploying with Americans or others. And I wonder whether the panel would like to comment on this issue, i.e., do we have the resources perhaps to operate effectively in a area group? Thank you.
So I think this very good question is symptomatic of a much wider truth, which is in military technology, nothing ever stands still. So the castle was killed by the cannon, and the telegraph absolutely transformed how militaries operate. And what we're seeing now is another of these inflection processes where the precision missile and a world that is largely transparent, not least from space, is going to triumph over the conventional platforms, whether they're carriers or air bases or big armored formations. So we cannot possibly think that any aircraft carrier, including the mighty US nuclear-propelled carriers, will seriously go in range of Chinese carrier-killing ballistic and cruise missiles, which have a range now of 1,600 kilometers and will reach 3,000 kilometers, because 20 of those missiles coming at once from all points of the compass against a carrier with, in the case of the US vessel, 6,000 people on board is just not a reasonable proposition. So the original purpose for which the Queen Elizabeth was designed, which was to take the Joint Strike Fighter in reasonable numbers, and we don't have reasonable numbers, and be prepared to penetrate the advanced air defense of peer competitors like China and Russia. Colloquially, could you bomb Beijing, is an absolute fantasy. And that is not to say that the carrier is not going to be any use. It is a magnificent piece of military machinery. It will find many things to do, I think, as part of a manned-unmanned autonomous network. But it is simply not going to do what we thought in the 1990s it might do, because technology at range has killed it.
And either of you would like to come in?
Probably one brief thing, because of the reference to Twitter and the aircraft carrier being called a nice target, and the unequal intelligence picture that we have relative to, say, our Chinese competitors, in that we can see Twitter, they can see Twitter, and you can manipulate a lot of Western social media data quite readily. But if, while that carrier is deployed to the region, we wanted to examine Chinese social media, particularly, say, Sina Weibo data, there are perhaps 2 providers in the West who are allowed access to that data, and that's to watch various commercial brands. So if any defense agency, intelligence agency, or even associated technology company were to try and get access to that data to see what was being discussed about the aircraft carrier in China, it would be impossible for us to do so, and it would be quickly shut down by the Chinese authorities.
Okay.
No, it's all right. No. I would only add small points to what Richard said. So I'll leave it.
I had one from Lord Anson of Swansea, which actually touches on something I think Michael said at the end of his talk. What does the review tell us about the proposed relations with our neighbours in the EU post-Brexit? It's a very good question, because it doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah,
but at the same time, what should it have told us?
Yes, I mean, the answer is very little. Too much of the review simply mentioned our commitment to NATO as being fundamental, which of course it is, and our attempt or our desire to take a European leadership role in NATO, which again is entirely sensible. The way in which it had a very sort of Delphic phrase that we will look to work with our European allies in new and flexible ways. But that was just a cover for saying we don't know how we're going to do it. And I thought it was rather disappointing that the whole process that had gone into the review, that, I mean, even with COVID, that there hadn't been more discussions with our European allies as to what we might say in the ways that we might have actually made a more positive series of noises in the review about the future of our relations, even in the EU context, in cooperation as set down in some of the documentation. So it was disappointing, because there was a sense that it was too sensitive to say anything substantial about, so that in the central government they said, leave it, just don't mention it, we'll worry about that later on. And that just diminishes a bit more the value of this process in the way it's been presented to us in 2021. Too much has been left to be done in 22, 23, 24.
Interestingly, we've had a question submitted by Frank Dominy, who's asked me to read it out, which touches perhaps on another aspect of this, in which he asks, will the new EU rules on ethical use of artificial intelligence inhibit the design, deployment and use of artificial intelligence in military weapons?
I think Rich and I probably agree with this, in that my initial response is no, but not because of any characteristic of the proposed regulations, more so the fact that there's a great deal of technical infrastructure we need to put in place first, quite basic tech, before we will start to exploit semi or fully autonomous weapon systems. So there's just a time lag. But then the frustration is more that we are incredibly comfortable in inhabiting the moral philosophy of applying AI in the military space. We become more uncomfortable trying to devise legislation that would actually have to hold someone accountable, whether it's a programmer or a decision maker. And then, as a consequence, if you get to that idea of fielding something, there's just a great deal of sucking of teeth, and no one wants to sign off on it because nothing is yet clear. So I'm actually quite optimistic about providing some more codified AI principles, and the Department of Defense's in the US, its AI principles, I think, are very good. They tread that fine line between liberal democratic values and military pragmatism. So I'm actually optimistic that we're getting beyond the moral philosophy to something tangible.
I had a question submitted to me earlier.
Can I add to that? So I completely agree with Ollie, and I mean, artificial intelligence is going to underpin, already is, how we do intelligence, how commanders take decisions, how we control operations, how we do the logistics. So the way that they support how we think is going to happen, and is well underway now. It is also fundamental to how we use autonomy, and autonomy is going to happen. And it will be used by all major armed forces around the world, and there are major ethical questions to be overcome here. And I agree absolutely with Ollie that this is a debate that is not terribly mature right now. We would shy away from the idea that there would be autonomous weapons of mass destruction, and I think that's common ground. But when you ask most people, do you think that we should field autonomous killing machines, they say no. And then if you say to them, okay, so we won't do that, but we'll send your children instead, and they may not come back, how do you feel about it now? And they then say, well, there's something we need to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. So David Manning sent a number of questions in advance, but there's one part of multiple question I just want to put, because it raises a sort of slightly different aspect. He says, how is the review's emphasis on standing up to an assertive and antagonistic China? Industrial espionage, hacking, wolf warrior diplomacy, repression in Hong Kong, treatment of the Uyghurs, etc. How is that compatible with the Prime Minister's self-confessed xenophilia and our wish to increase the United Kingdom's share of the Chinese market? Michael, would you like to?
Yes, I mean, this is a theme that runs through the government. It's not to do with the review as such. And it's this attempt to try to arrive at a balance, which is not so dissimilar to the sort of thing that we tried to do with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, to say that we have red lines and we mean it, but when you understand our red lines, we will look to discuss everything that we can possibly discuss. The problem with just applying that to China is that China is more intrinsically part of our economy than the Soviet Union ever was. And that China is more important to the future of global politics than even the Soviet Union ever was in the height of the Cold War. So it's a much more delicate balance to try to arrive at. But the biggest challenge, I think, and David Manning is absolutely right, on the one hand we try to be assertive on particular issues, which is to say we're not going to roll over on this, we are going to stand up for China, for our citizens in Hong Kong, and we are going to stand up on the treatment of the Uyghurs and on Huawei and so on. But we do recognize that China will play an enormous role in the 21st century. That balance is something that we will try to achieve, but the most important element in achieving it is consistency in the attitude of our allies. And at the moment, there's so little consistency among the Western allies in the way they address China. And I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will actually give us a strand in which the other Western allies could perhaps be more consistent. But I have to say, we haven't set a very good example of this in Western Europe, with our main allies in Italy and Germany, France and the United Kingdom. And the Chinese play us off in this respect. So by all means, let's try to establish the red lines and the sense of dialogue, but we've got to do it much more collectively than has been the case so far.
Thank you. I have a question coming in from Anne Cormack, who will put it to her. Hopefully we'll manage to contact her. Anne, are you there? I'll read it out.
Hello?
Yes, hello, Anne.
Hello?
Hello.
I hope you can hear me now.
We can, yes. Would you like to put your question?
So, thank you very much. My question has to do with where we're going to get these skills from. So we're making a massive shift into the digital world. The world's pressure on digital skills is enormous, and those people who have them are at a premium, as Oliver knows. And whilst the private sector partnerships he talked about might well provide some of the skill set, my question to the panel really is, from all the work that has gone into inclusion and diversity until now, do you think enough has been done to attract the brains, or the female brains in the country that can actually be brought to bear in the digital space who might otherwise not have been attracted to defence forces? Thank you.
So I think we should approach the problem in a slightly different way, which is to recognise that defence and security in the modern age is a whole of society effort. This is no longer going to be something that you leave to a relatively small number of volunteer, regular people who are predominantly male because of their ability to drag their luggage up cold, wet Welsh hills. So to be successful in AI, autonomy, robotics, precision missiles, global surveillance, maneuver, land, sea and air, space, all of those things. We will need a mixture of some regular people, of course, but also reserves we can bring in when we need bigger armed forces or different armed forces. We'll need civil servants, we'll need industry, and we'll need robots. And in there, we'll absolutely need to draw on the finest talents in British society, having educated them. So none of this really works if our school system doesn't produce youngsters who are fit for purpose in the digital age. And I think when we address a problem like that, then we'll find that there is a natural place in the business of defence and security for everybody, and we'll need everybody if we're going to be competitive in hard times.
I'd like to ask the next question. Having been sceptical about the nuclear deterrent for some time in the modern world, what about the decision to increase the cap on our stockpile of nuclear warheads to 260? I think that took a lot of people by surprise. But will and should Britain now contribute to nuclear proliferation as a result?
Very good question, because it was one of the very few aspects of the review that wasn't briefed out in advance. It came as a complete surprise a few hours before it was actually announced. And the rationale that we're increasing the warhead stockpile because of enhanced Russian defences around Moscow just doesn't hold any water. I think the reason that we're thinking about increasing these numbers, and remember this increase will take some years to achieve, and it will partly depend on the new US warhead as to whether the US will go ahead with their new, was it the W93, I think it is, as opposed to W88. And the uncertainties around this are quite considerable. The question for Britain, I think, and what I think they're thinking about, is that they may need to deploy more warheads on a different combination of nuclear submarines in future, possibly in different circumstances. That's not to say that they want to go down the tactical nuclear route, but there may be this question that perhaps 2 boats might be out at one time, and that might require a slightly bigger stockpile. Even then, if you do the maths on it, the number of tubes, 8 tubes with 5, or possibly 8 tubes with 6 warheads on each missile, you still don't really come up with 260, even with 2 boats out at any one time. But it's an interesting problem, and I think what the government has wanted to do is get this announcement in now, take the flak that may be coming to it because of that, and then have the flexibility in years to come to think differently about the way the British nuclear deterrent might be employed. But in the short term, for sure, it puts us on the wrong side of the proliferation debate. It makes it difficult, as I said, for our partners who've always backed us on arms control matters to, they will look askance at the fact that when we go to the review conference later this year, we'll be one of the few countries that's increasing its stockpile. We put ourselves in them with Russia and North Korea and China, as opposed to the powers that try to drive these warhead numbers down. So I think it's a decision which will need to be discussed, and it will be quite difficult for the government when people come back to it. I think they'll have to explain it much more carefully than they've done so far.
Richard?
Thank you. So, I think having more nuclear weapons in the world is a really regrettable thing. Even though this increase is small, I suppose you can make a short-term argument that you might need to increase your stockpile in order to maintain the effectiveness of what you're doing now, either because you need to manage the stockpile, or as Michael describes, you need to put a different combination out at sea at any one time, or possibly because you need more warheads on a given boat to penetrate the anti-ballistic missile defences, which are improving amongst our potential opponents, and use more decoys. Yeah. Having said that, I think it's time to begin to look beyond the present conception of a nuclear deterrent, because we might imagine that in due course, might be 30 years away, quantum computing will make the seas and space transparent, and advances in long-range precision conventional missiles will narrow the margin that currently nuclear weapons have in terms of survivability. And we ought to be able to conceive of a world that doesn't rely on nations having the ability to dismantle the planet as some sort of effective deterrent.
I've got another question come in, which I'll put to you, Oliver, if I may, from James Cunliffe. James?
Yes, thanks very much. It's really, I know a lot of the discussion has been about defence in particular, but I'd like to perhaps draw some comments from the panel about Foreign Office and DFID merging, and whether you see synergies there that can really help with the whole integrated package, particularly thinking that DFID led quite a lot of global Britain's peace and security initiatives around the world. And I wonder whether there are some comments from the panel about where you think that might go and how it might enhance our integrated approach. Thank you.
Oliver, would like to start on that?
I think the integration of FCO and DFID is attempting to solve a Whitehall problem that frankly doesn't exist in country or on operations. And I'm a number of years out of date, but the level of interaction we had between diplomats and development officials, particularly in conflict zones, was extraordinary. It felt like one team, it operated like one team, we understood the objectives and we all worked together. When you return to London, there's an enforced separation of powers and it all becomes a little bit toxic and occasionally quite frustrating. But the danger there is that one could undermine positive competition in the field in attempting to solve a bureaucratic problem of communication instead. So I think from my perspective, the jury is still out on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It could work well, but the fact is, DFID had a very good reputation around the world, and that is now, as it were, put into a different box because it's of this change at the centre. And the cuts that are being made, the immediate cuts in foreign aid, just transmit themselves around the world as Britain withdrawing from those commitments. And that, as I said, is strategically incoherent with the global Britain image that we want now to create for a relatively small amount of money, I have to say. You're talking about 4 to 5 billion this year. And the aid budget comes down in any case, in the short term, with the collapse in our GDP as a result of the lockdowns. And if it's to remain low, then that will have to be subject to a change in the law. So it will go to Parliament, as I understand it, next year, where it might actually be, I mean, the government might lose on that.
I've got one more question we might just be able to squeeze in from Charles Vivian. Charles. Are you with us, Charles?
Yes. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
I read it out for you, but the question I think was, to pick up on one of your points, is digitization or technology, modern technology, because after all technology has been part of the development of force for a very long time, is it an end in itself or is it a means to an end? And if it's a force multiplier, a means to an end, will it be effective if there's insufficient force to take the greatest advantage of the new technologies?
We've almost run out of time, but I'll ask Richard very briefly to answer that.
Unequivocally, in my view, a means to an end. This is just how technology changes how you do defence and security, how you build armies, navies and air forces and integrate them. So a manned, unmanned, autonomous mix will restore the competitiveness of our armed forces against very capable enemies. And it will make them more sustainably affordable as well, which is fortunate but not the most important thing. But it's just another way of delivering effect and mass, and without sufficient mass there'll just be tokens and that won't work.
I think sadly I'm going to have to call a halt as our hour is up, but I think we've had a very interesting discussion today, and I'm very grateful to our three panellists for having come and taken part today, and also even more thankful for the people who've managed through some vicissitudes to get through to us through technological means. And I think we've got all the questions that people put in. But thank you to you for taking part. I think this is a discussion that will continue for some time now. I think we only scratched the surface of a lot of it today, and maybe we'll come back to it ourselves. But very much thank you to Richard and Mike and Ollie, and thank you to all of you too.